The golden chandeliers of La Couronne cast their warm glow across a dining room that existed in a realm beyond ordinary reach. Each fixture had been imported from a workshop in Florence, where artisans still shaped glass using techniques perfected in the 1600s. The crystals caught the light and scattered it like stars, creating an atmosphere that seemed to exist outside of time itself. White linen draped each table with the precision of a museum exhibit, pressed and starched until the fabric held its shape like architecture. This was not simply a restaurant. It was a cathedral of wealth, where reservations required 6 months of patience and a bank account that could withstand a 4-figure dinner for two without flinching. The walls were paneled in dark walnut that had been harvested from trees older than the nation itself. Original artwork hung at precisely measured intervals, a Monet here, a Renoir there, pieces that belonged in museums but resided instead in this temple of gastronomy. The air smelled of white truffle and aged wine, of money and power, and the kind of exclusivity that couldn't be purchased with cash alone. It required connections, pedigree, the invisible currency of belonging to a world that most people only glimpse through magazines and television screens. In the far corner, beneath the Monet that most visitors mistook for a reproduction, because surely no restaurant would hang a genuine masterpiece where wine might splash and conversation might disturb, sat the VIP table, table 7. It was larger than the others by precisely 18 inches, positioned to overlook the entire room like a throne surveying its kingdom. The chairs were upholstered in burgundy velvet that had been woven in a mill that produced fabric exclusively for European royalty. The table itself was mahogany, its surface polished to a mirror shine that reflected the chandelier light like still water at sunset. A small brass plaque on the wall nearby simply read, "Reserved in elegant script, offering no further explanation because none was needed. Those who belonged there knew. Those who did not never asked." The table had hosted senators and celebrities, tech moguls, and old money aristocrats. It had witnessed business deals worth billions and marriage proposals worth everything. It was not furniture. It was a symbol, a statement of power that required no words. On this particular Friday evening in late September, the maitre d', a silver-haired gentleman named Marcus Chen, checked his watch with practiced discretion. 8:15. The reservation was for 8:30. He adjusted the already perfect arrangement of silverware at table 7, his movements carrying the weight of ritual. 23 years he had worked at La Couronne. 23 years of understanding that some tables were not merely furniture but symbols, statements of power that required no words. Marcus had started as a waiter when La Couronne first opened its doors in a much humbler location. He had been young then, fresh from Taiwan, his English accented but his work ethic unquestionable. He had learned every aspect of fine dining from the ground up, had studied wine regions and etiquette manuals, had practiced the delicate art of reading people's needs before they spoke them aloud. And he had watched the restaurant's owner build something extraordinary from nothing, brick by brick, decision by decision, never forgetting where he came from or who helped him along the way. The front entrance opened with a whisper of hydraulics and expensive engineering. A young couple swept through with the energy of people who believed the world turned at their command. Bradley Morrison, the third, wore a suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, tailored in Milan by a man whose waiting list stretched 18 months into the future. His sandy hair was slicked back with product that promised to make him look older than his 27 years, more distinguished, more worthy of the trust fund that bore his grandfather's name. His watch was Swiss, platinum, worth enough to feed a family of 4 for 3 years. His companion, Amber Whitfield, moved on heels so tall they could have been classified as architectural achievements, each step a calculated performance of wealth and beauty. Her blonde hair cascaded in waves that had required 3 hours and $500 at a salon that morning, where women who didn't need to work spent their afternoons being sculpted into acceptable versions of themselves. Her dress was designer, her jewelry genuine, her smile practiced in mirrors, since she was old enough to understand that appearance was currency in the world she inhabited. They had money. New money. The kind that came from trust funds and stock options, inheritance and lucky timing rather than sacrifice and struggle. The kind that had never known the taste of ramen eaten alone in a studio apartment, had never felt the weight of choosing between groceries and electricity, had never understood that most people lived entire lives without ever seeing the inside of a place like La Couronne. Their eyes swept the restaurant with the casual entitlement of tourists claiming landmarks for photographs, assessing and cataloging and finding everything worthy of their presence. Bradley's gaze landed on table 7 like a hawk spotting prey. Something in his chest expanded with want. He desired it. Not because he needed it, but because it existed, and he did not yet possess it. In his world, desire and acquisition were the same thing. If you wanted something, you took it. Money made the rules bend. Status made people step aside. And he had both. He turned to Amber, his voice carrying across the hushed atmosphere with all the subtlety of a car alarm in a library. "That one. We're sitting there." Amber's eyes lit up with understanding and agreement. She nodded, her smile widening into something sharp and hungry. "Obviously. I mean, look at it. That's where we belong." Marcus Chen approached with the smooth glide of someone who had diffused 1,000 small conflicts before they could become incidents. His smile was professional, warm, impenetrable, the expression of a man who had learned to armor himself in courtesy. "Good evening. Welcome to La Couronne. Do you have a reservation?" Bradley waved a hand as if swatting away an insect. The gesture was dismissive, rude in its casualness. "We don't need one. That table. Move whoever's supposed to sit there." The words hung in the air like smoke. Around them, other diners glanced up from plates of seared foie gras and truffle-infused risotto. Conversations dimmed by degrees, like lights on a theatrical dimmer switch. An older couple in their 70s, celebrating their 50th anniversary, exchanged glances. A business dinner of four paused mid-negotiation. A woman dining alone with a book set down her wine glass and looked up with interest. This was not how things were done here. This was not how things were done anywhere that mattered. Marcus's smile never wavered, but something behind his eyes shifted into a higher gear of diplomacy. He had handled difficult customers before. Drunk hedge fund managers. Demanding socialites. People who believed their wealth entitled them to rewrite basic human decency. But something about this couple's casual cruelty set off alarm bells in his mind. "I'm afraid that table is reserved for a very special guest. However, I have an excellent table near the window that offers a wonderful view of the city lights. Or perhaps the alcove near the fireplace. Very intimate, very." "I said that one." Bradley's voice rose half an octave, taking on the petulant quality of a child denied a toy. "Do you know who I am? My father owns half the real estate in this city. Morrison Properties? We don't sit at ordinary tables. We sit at the best table." Amber laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of razor blades. "Just move them. Whoever they are, I'm sure they'll understand." She looked Marcus up and down, her gaze carrying an assessment that had nothing to do with his skills as a maitre d', and everything to do with something uglier, something that lived in the shadows of privilege and ignorance. "Unless there's a problem here?" The implication crystallized in the air between them, like frost on a window. Marcus, an Asian American man who had built his career on grace under pressure, felt the familiar weight of a judgment being passed on his accent, his appearance, his perceived station in life. He had faced this before. The assumptions. The casual racism wrapped in silk scarves and expensive cologne. The belief that his job defined his worth, that his service meant subservience, that his courtesy could be mistaken for weakness. "There is no problem," he said quietly, each word carefully chosen and precisely delivered. "But I cannot seat you at that table. It is spoken for. Reserved. I have many other excellent options that I would be honored to." Bradley stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the sharper scent of arrogance and entitlement. "Then unspeak for it. We're paying customers. We deserve the best. Isn't that how this works? Money talks? Well, listen." He pulled out his wallet, thick with cards that had no spending limits, and made a show of thumbing through them. "How much? What's the table worth? Name your price. 500? 1,000? I'll pay whatever you want." Marcus felt his jaw tighten but kept his expression neutral. "Sir, this is not about money. The table is reserved." "I cannot or will not." Amber interjected, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "Because it seems like you're choosing to be difficult. And I have to wonder why. Is it because we're young? Is it some kind of power trip? Because I assure you, you don't have the kind of power you think you do." Before Marcus could respond, before he could navigate this increasingly impossible situation, with the diplomacy that had served him for 2 decades, the front door opened again. This time, the change in atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations that had begun to resume fell silent once more. Heads turned not with the nosiness of gossip but with the instinct of recognition that some people simply commanded space by existing within it. The man who entered was tall, perhaps 6'3", with the kind of presence that made the doorway seem smaller. His skin was deep mahogany, the rich dark brown that caught the chandelier light and seemed to absorb it, radiating a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the gravity of his being. His head was cleanly shaved, reflecting the light like polished stone. He wore a charcoal suit that had been tailored with such precision it appeared to be part of his body rather than covering it. No logos. No flash. No jewelry except a simple watch that cost less than Bradley's but told time just as accurately. No need for any of it. He was 58 years old. His name was Marcus Washington. And he moved through the world with the quiet certainty of someone who had built his kingdom brick by brick, dollar by dollar, decision by decision, failure by failure, until failure was no longer an option. His journey had started in the projects of Newark, in a 3-room apartment he shared with his mother and 2 sisters. His father had left when Marcus was 6, left behind nothing but debt and a lesson about what kind of man not to become. His mother worked 2 jobs cleaning offices at night, working the cafeteria at a hospital during the day, her hands cracked and worn by chemicals and hard labor. She would come home exhausted, collapse into a chair that had been rescued from someone's curb, and still find the energy to ask her children about their homework, their dreams, their plans to escape the gravity of poverty that pulled so many down. Marcus had learned to cook out of necessity. With his mother working doubles, someone had to feed his sisters. He started with boxed macaroni and canned soup, graduated to eggs and rice, eventually discovered that cooking was not just survival but art. By 15, he was working weekends at a diner, watching the cook transform simple ingredients into something people craved. By 17, he had a scholarship to culinary school and a dream bigger than the projects could contain. The path from there to here had been anything but straight. Culinary school while working 40 hours a week. Sleeping in his car for 8 months to save money for a deposit on his first tiny restaurant. Getting turned down by 47 banks before the 48th took a chance on a young black man with no collateral and nothing but ambition and a business plan written on notebook paper. Opening that first restaurant in a Newark strip mall, between a laundromat and a check-cashing place, serving soul food with a French twist to customers who became family. The success had been slow at first, then sudden. Word spread. Critics came. Awards followed. Then investors. Then expansion. One restaurant became 2, became 5, became 12. La Couronne was the crown jewel, opened 7 years ago as proof that a kid from the projects could create something that belonged in the same conversation as the finest restaurants in the world. But Marcus Washington had never forgotten. Never forgot the nights his mother cried over bills she couldn't pay. Never forgot the way people looked through him when he was young, as if poverty made him invisible. Never forgot the assumptions, the casual racism, the doors closed in his face because his skin was the wrong color and his address was the wrong zip code. He remembered all of it. And he had built his success on a foundation of never treating anyone the way he had been treated. Marcus Chen saw him and something in his shoulders relaxed for the first time since Bradley and Amber had walked in. He began to move toward the entrance, relief flooding through him like cool water. But Marcus Washington raised one hand in a subtle gesture. Not yet. Let me see this. Let me understand. The billionaire's dark eyes swept the scene with the efficiency of a security camera and the wisdom of someone who had learned to read human nature like a survival skill. He took in Bradley's aggressive posture, the way the younger man leaned into Marcus Chen's space like a bully on a playground. He saw Amber's dismissive expression, the curl of her lip, the casual cruelty in her eyes. He noted the maitre d's carefully maintained composure, recognized the tension in the older man's shoulders, understood immediately that this was not just a reservation dispute but something uglier. And he saw table 7, still empty, still waiting, still his. He understood immediately what was happening. He had seen this play before. He had lived this play. He knew every line, every beat, every inevitable conclusion. The only question was how he would direct the ending. Bradley hadn't noticed him yet. His attention was still focused on Marcus Chen, his voice growing louder with each passing second of resistance, feeding off his own frustration and Amber's encouragement. You know what? Forget asking. We're sitting down. He grabbed Amber's hand and began walking toward table 7. His stride full of the confidence that came from never having been told no and having it mean anything. If you won't seat us, we'll seat ourselves. That's when Marcus Washington moved. Not quickly. Not with aggression. He simply stepped into their path with the immovable quality of a mountain that had stood for millennia and would stand for millennia more. His movement was economical, efficient, carrying no wasted energy. He didn't need to hurry. The table wasn't going anywhere. Neither was he. Bradley pulled up short, irritation flashing across his face like lightning before a storm. Excuse me. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Move aside. Know your place. Get out of my way. Marcus Washington didn't move. He stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, his posture neither aggressive nor submissive, but perfectly balanced. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were alive with something that might have been amusement or might have been something far more dangerous. The kind of calm that came from knowing exactly who you were and not needing anyone else's validation. That table is occupied, he said. His voice was deep, resonant, the kind that didn't need volume to carry authority. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being heard, not because he shouted, but because when he spoke, it mattered. Bradley's laugh was harsh, humorless, containing not joy but derision. There's literally no one sitting there. Are you blind? Or just confused? Neither. It's mine. 2 words. Simple. Direct. Carrying the weight of absolute truth, and the certainty of someone who had never been given anything but had earned everything. Amber looked him up and down, her lip curling into something that was supposed to be a smile but looked more like a sneer. Her eyes traveled from his shoes nice but not ostentatious to his suit expensive but understated to his face. And in that gaze, was a calculation, an assessment, a judgment being passed, based on nothing but the color of his skin and the assumptions that came with it. Yours? Did you reserve it? Because I'm pretty sure we can pay more than whatever you. She paused, her eyes making another assessment, this one even more poisonous than the first. Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried across the silent room. Whatever you can afford. No offense, but you don't exactly look like you belong at the VIP table. The silence that followed was the kind that made people hold their breath. Around the dining room, silverware stopped clinking. Wine stopped pouring. Conversations died mid-sentence. Everyone was watching now, the pretense of privacy abandoned in favor of witnessing whatever was about to unfold. The anniversary couple sat frozen, their hands clasped together on the white tablecloth. The business dinner had abandoned all pretense of negotiation. The woman with the book had set it aside entirely, her attention riveted to the scene unfolding. A young waitress near the kitchen door, her brown skin gleaming under the lights, her hands clutching a water pitcher like a lifeline, felt her heart hammering. Her name was Jessica Torres, and she was 24 years old, putting herself through medical school 4 nights a week by working at La Couronne. She had served Bradley and Amber water when they first arrived, had felt the weight of their dismissive glances, the way they looked through her as if she were furniture. And now she watched this man, this tall, calm, powerful man stand his ground against them, and something in her chest tightened with hope and fear in equal measure. Marcus Washington smiled. It was not a cruel smile. It was not even an angry smile. It was the smile of someone who had learned long ago that the best response to ignorance was not rage but patience, seasoned with just enough reality to make the lesson stick. It was the smile of a teacher about to educate students who didn't know they needed the lesson. I don't need to reserve it, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room without rising in volume at all. Each word was clear, precise, deliberate. This is my table. In my restaurant. That I own. He let that sink in for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds during which the color started to drain from Bradley's face like water from a cracked glass. 3 seconds during which Amber's expression shifted from smug superiority to confused uncertainty. 3 seconds during which the entire restaurant held its collective breath. Then he continued, his tone conversational, almost gentle, as if discussing the weather, or sharing a recipe. Actually, I own all of them. La Couronne. This location. The 3-star in Manhattan where we earned Michelin recognition. The one in San Francisco that overlooks the bay. The seafood place in Boston that senators visit when they want privacy. The steakhouse in Chicago where the president ate last month. All 12 restaurants in the Washington Hospitality Group. Plus, the catering company. The culinary school. The food distribution network. The wine import business. He paused, watching the information process across their faces like watching ice melt in the sundae. So when I say this is my table, I'm being quite literal. This is my restaurant. My table. My choice, who sits here. The room held its collective breath. Somewhere, a wine glass was set down with a soft clink that sounded like a gavel in the silence. The woman near the window whispered to her companion, her voice barely audible but clear enough to carry 2 words that rippled outward like stones in still water. That's him. And then another voice, from a different table, Marcus Washington. Oh my God. And another. The Marcus Washington. From the cover of Forbes. Recognition spread like wildfire. Phones stayed in pockets. La Couronne's strict no photography policy was enforced with the seriousness of a museum protecting priceless art, but the knowledge traveled faster than any digital connection. They were witnessing something. A moment. A lesson being taught in real time. Bradley's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No sound emerged. His brain was trying to process information that contradicted everything his ego had told him about how this encounter would unfold. He had walked in believing himself the most important person in the room. Had assessed the space and claimed it as his right. And now he was discovering that he was not a king but a child playing dress-up, and the actual monarch had just arrived. He looked at Amber. She looked back, her eyes wide, her earlier confidence evaporating like champagne bubbles. Her hand, which had been clutching his arm with possessive certainty, loosened its grip. Her carefully maintained posture slumped by degrees, the architecture of her arrogance crumbling. Marcus Chen stepped forward, his voice steady and clear, pitched to carry respect without subservience. "Mr. Washington, your table is ready. I apologize for the confusion." "There's no confusion, Marcus." The billionaire's eyes never left the young couple. "These two simply made a mistake. We all make them. The question is what we do next." Bradley found his voice, though it came out smaller than before, stripped of its earlier arrogance like paint peeling off old wood. "I didn't know we didn't realize that I owned the restaurant?" Marcus Washington's eyebrow rose fractionally, the gesture eloquent in its economy. "Or that someone like me could own a restaurant like this?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Sharp. Precise. Cutting through pretense and comfortable lies to expose the ugly truth beneath. Bradley's face flushed red, the color spreading from his collar to his hairline. Amber looked at the floor, studying the pattern of the Italian marble, as if it held the answers to questions she didn't want to ask herself. Around them, the watching diners sat frozen. Witnesses to a moment that was teaching a lesson some of them needed and all of them would remember. The anniversary couple exchanged glances heavy with meaning. The business dinner shifted uncomfortably. The woman with the book felt tears prickling her eyes for reasons she couldn't quite name, something about justice and dignity, and the way power could be wielded with grace instead of cruelty. "Both," Bradley said finally. The word dragged from somewhere deep inside where truth lived uncomfortably alongside all his comfortable fictions. At least he had the grace not to lie. "I assumed both. And I was wrong. Completely wrong." Marcus Washington studied him for a long moment. His dark eyes seeing past the expensive suit and the trust fund arrogance to something younger and more vulnerable underneath. He saw a kid, really, 27 going on 14. Someone who had been given everything except the tools to be a decent human being. Someone who had learned all the wrong lessons from parents who probably made the same mistakes, perpetuating cycles of entitlement and casual cruelty generation after generation. Then something in his expression softened, not into forgiveness, but into something more complex. Understanding, perhaps. Or recognition of a younger version of countless people he had encountered on his path from nothing to everything. People who had underestimated him, dismissed him, looked through him or down on him based on skin color or zip code or accent or the assumption that their world was the only one that mattered. He could have destroyed them. Could have called security and had them removed. Could have used his power like a hammer, crushing their arrogance and humiliating them in front of everyone. Could have made them feel small the way they had tried to make Marcus Chen feel small, the way they probably made service workers feel small every day of their privileged lives. But Marcus Washington had not built an empire by being cruel. He had built it by being better than the people who tried to tear him down. By refusing to let their ignorance define his character. By understanding that real power was not about domination but about elevation, not about crushing others but about lifting everyone to a higher standard. "You see that man?" He gestured toward Marcus Chen with respect and affection. "His name is also Marcus. Marcus Chen. He's been with me for 23 years. Started as a waiter when I opened my first restaurant in a strip mall in Newark, between a laundromat and a check-cashing place. Worked his way up through dedication, skill, and respect for every single person who walks through these doors, regardless of how much money is in their wallet or what their last name is." He let that sink in, watching Bradley and Amber process the information, seeing the shame start to settle over them like a heavy coat. He speaks 4 languages. Has a degree in hospitality management that he earned while working full-time. Has trained half the maitre d's in this city. And he treats the dishwasher with the same respect he treats a senator. Because he understands something that you clearly haven't learned yet. Dignity is not negotiable based on job titles or bank accounts. He shifted his gaze to Jessica, who stood trembling near the kitchen door, her eyes wide, her water pitcher forgotten in her hands. "That's Jessica Torres. She's putting herself through medical school. Works here 4 nights a week, takes morning classes, studies during lunch breaks, never complains, treats every customer like they matter because she understands that service is not servitude. That helping people is not weakness. That courtesy is strength." His voice remained calm, but each word landed with precision, like a surgeon cutting away diseased tissue to save the patient. "You came in here assuming that money gives you the right to take what you want. That your comfort matters more than basic courtesy. You were about to sit at a table that wasn't yours, and felt entitled to dismiss the person who tried to help you. You spoke to him with disrespect. Looked at him with judgment. Made assumptions about his worth based on his job. The silence was absolute. A dropped pin would have sounded like thunder. And when I stood in your way, you made assumptions about who I was and what I could afford based on what, exactly? No one answered. The question didn't really need one. Everyone in the room knew the answer. It was written in Amber's earlier assessment, in her dismissive tone, in the way she had looked at him and decided he didn't belong before he even spoke. I built this from nothing, Marcus Washington continued, his voice taking on a different quality now, something that was part testimony and part teaching, part personal history and part universal truth. My mother cleaned offices. My father left when I was 6. We lived in the projects in Newark, 3 people in 3 rooms, cockroaches in the kitchen and gunshots outside at night. I learned to cook because someone had to feed my sisters while my mother worked doubles just to keep us in that apartment. He paused, letting them see him not as the billionaire in the expensive suit but as the child he had been, the young man he had grown into, the struggles that had shaped him. Worked 3 jobs while getting my culinary degree. Slept in my car for 8 months saving money for a deposit on my first location. Ate ramen and day-old bread. Wore the same suit to every meeting until it was shiny at the elbows and frayed at the cuffs. Got turned down by 47 banks before one finally took a chance on me. And at every step, I met people like you. People who assumed I didn't belong. People who thought they could see my ceiling before I even showed them my foundation. His eyes swept the room, making sure the lesson was being received by everyone present, not just the 2 standing shamefaced before him. The anniversary couple was crying quietly, holding hands across the table. The business dinner had abandoned all pretense of work. The woman with the book was openly weeping, her shoulders shaking. But here's what I learned. Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to prove anything to strangers or demand recognition or take up space that belongs to others. Real wealth doesn't flash or flex or need validation from people who don't matter. Real class treats the janitor with the same respect as the CEO, because at the end of the day, we're all just people trying to make it through this life with some measure of dignity intact. The words settled over the room like snow, quiet and heavy and transformative. You can buy a seat at any table in this city. You can buy expensive clothes and watches and wine. You can buy access and influence and all the trappings of success. But you cannot buy character. You cannot buy decency. You cannot buy the kind of respect that actually matters. The kind that comes from how you treat people when you think nobody's watching. When you think they can't fight back. When you think they don't matter. Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I apologize. His voice cracked slightly. We were wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. He stopped, struggling for words that could encompass the magnitude of his mistake. There's no excuse for how we acted. For how I spoke to Mr. Chen. For the assumptions we made. For all of it. Amber nodded, her earlier smugness replaced by something that looked almost like shame, the kind that burned in the chest and wouldn't be easily forgotten. I'm sorry too. So sorry. We were awful. Terrible. I can't believe we. She stopped, her perfectly made-up eyes filling with tears. I'm so embarrassed. Marcus Washington regarded them both with an expression that might have been calculation or might have been compassion. It was impossible to tell which. He was assessing them, weighing their sincerity, deciding what kind of people they were beneath the mistakes. Were they genuinely learning or simply embarrassed at being caught? Would this change them or would they walk out and forget, returning to their old patterns like water finding its level? Then he did something that no one in the room expected. He smiled. A real smile this time, reaching his eyes, transforming his face from stern teacher to something warmer. I appreciate that. Genuinely. He gestured toward the restaurant, his hand encompassing the elegant space and all the tables within it. Now, Marcus will find you a table. I recommend the duck. It's exceptional tonight. Chef Pierre has been perfecting the technique for 15 years. The skin comes out like glass, the meat tender enough to cut with a fork. Truly extraordinary. Bradley blinked, confusion and hope warring on his face. You're still going to serve us? Why wouldn't I? You made a mistake. You acknowledged it. You apologized. That's more than a lot of people do. That's more than most people are capable of. He paused, his smile taking on a slightly sharper edge, the kind that suggested he was not entirely forgiving but willing to extend grace. Besides, I suspect you'll treat your server with exemplary respect tonight. Won't you? Yes, sir, they said in unison, the words automatic but carrying the weight of genuine contrition, the desperate sincerity of people who had just learned a lesson they should have known years ago. Marcus Chen stepped forward, his own smile warm now, professional mask, replaced by something more authentic, the relief and pride of someone who had just watched his employer and friend handle a difficult situation with more grace than most people possessed. Right this way, please. As the couple followed him to a table near the kitchen, still nice, beautifully appointed with white linens and fresh flowers, but decidedly not, table 7 whispers began to circulate through the dining room like wind through trees. Phones stayed in pockets and purses, per the restaurant's strict policy, but everyone knew this story would spread. Not through digital channels, but through the older, more powerful network of human connection. People would tell their friends, their colleagues, their families, their children and grandchildren. They would say, I saw it happen. I was there. I witnessed grace under pressure. I watched power wielded with precision and mercy. I learned something about what it means to be truly wealthy, truly powerful, truly successful. Marcus Washington settled into his chair at table 7 with the ease of someone returning home after a long journey. The leather embraced him like an old friend. The view of the restaurant spread before him like a kingdom he had built with his own hands, from his own vision, through his own sacrifices. A server immediately appeared, not Jessica, but Michael, a young man who had worked here for 4 years while getting his architecture degree, with a glass of his preferred wine, a 20-year-old Bordeaux, that Marcus had selected himself from his private cellar in the basement. Michael, he said, smiling up at the young man. How are you? How's the thesis coming? It's coming, Mr. Washington. Slowly but surely. I'm defending next month. Outstanding. You'll have to show me the designs. I remember you mentioned sustainable urban housing? That's important work. Michael's face lit up. You remembered. Of course I remembered. Send me the presentation. I might know some people who'd be interested in funding that kind of project. They spoke for another minute, about architecture and dreams and the future, before Michael excused himself to attend to his other tables. And Marcus sat alone, though not lonely, never lonely when surrounded by the empire he had built, and looked out over his restaurant. From his vantage point, he could see the entire space. Could see Bradley and Amber sitting stiffly across from each other at their table near the kitchen, their earlier bravado replaced by the uncomfortable awareness of people who had just learned a lesson they should have known years ago. Could see Jessica approaching their table with practiced professionalism, her tray balanced perfectly, her smile polite but guarded. Could see the way they straightened in their chairs when she arrived, suddenly aware that every interaction carried weight, that how you treated people mattered, that service workers were human beings deserving of respect. He watched as Bradley said something to Jessica. He couldn't hear the words from across the room, but he saw the young man's earnest expression, saw Jessica's surprised smile, saw her shoulders relax by degrees. Later, Marcus would learn that Bradley had apologized for his earlier behavior, had thanked her for her patience, had asked her name, and actually listened to the answer. Small things, basic things. Things that should have been automatic but apparently required a billionaire's lesson to learn. A man approached table 7, hesitant but determined. He was perhaps 45, wearing a suit that was expensive but not ostentatious. His salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, his eyes carrying the weight of someone who had thought deeply about what he was about to say. Mr. Washington? I'm sorry to interrupt. Marcus looked up, his expression open and welcoming despite the interruption. He set down his wine glass, gave the man his full attention. Not an interruption at all. How can I help you? I just wanted to say what you did just now. How you handled that situation. The man's voice caught slightly. My son is 15. Thinks the world owes him everything because we've done well financially. Believes money is the measure of a person's worth. Treats service workers like they're beneath him. I've tried to teach him differently, but he doesn't listen to me anymore. He extended his hand. Marcus stood and took it, the handshake firm and warm. I'm going to tell him this story. About what real power looks like. About treating people with dignity. About the difference between wealth and class. Thank you for the lesson. For all of us. Tell him it's not about the money you have, Marcus said quietly. It's about the person you choose to be with it. Money is just a tool. It can build or destroy. Elevate or crush. The choice is ours. The man nodded, his eyes bright, and returned to his table where a woman waited with a knowing smile. They would talk about this moment over wine and dessert, would carry it home to their son, would use it as a touchstone for conversations about character and integrity. But he wasn't the last. Over the next hour and a half, as Marcus enjoyed his meal, the duck was indeed exceptional. Chef Pierre had outdone himself. 6 more people approached. A young entrepreneur who wanted advice on starting a hospitality business. An older woman who had met Marcus once at a charity function and wanted to thank him for his foundation scholarship program that had sent her granddaughter to college. A couple celebrating their 30th anniversary who simply wanted to express their admiration. A teacher who planned to share the story with her high school students. A veteran who had eaten at one of Marcus's restaurants through a program that provided free meals to homeless veterans who wanted to shake his hand and say thank you. Each time, Marcus set down his fork, gave them his full attention, treated the interruption not as an annoyance but as an honor. Because that was the point, wasn't it? Power meant nothing if you wielded it like a weapon. Wealth meant nothing if you hoarded it like a dragon guarding treasure. Success meant nothing if you climbed alone and kicked down the ladder behind you, leaving others in the darkness you escaped. Across the room, Bradley and Amber ate their meals in near silence. The food was extraordinary. Jessica had ensured they received the same level of service as every other guest, because that was what Marcus Washington expected of his staff, what he had trained them to deliver, what he modeled every single day. The duck was perfectly cooked, skin crackling and golden, meat tender and rich. The wine was excellent. The service impeccable, but the taste was probably lost on them, overshadowed by the bitter flavor of their own behavior reflected back at them like a mirror they couldn't avoid. They ate slowly, carefully, hyper-aware of every word, every gesture, every interaction. When Jessica refilled their water, they thanked her. When she brought bread, they asked about the bakery that provided it, actually listened to her answer. When she recommended a dessert, they took her suggestion and thanked her for the guidance. Small things. Basic things. Things that should have been automatic but had required humiliation to learn. When their check came, the total was just under $900, a fraction of what they could afford but still substantial. Bradley stared at it for a long moment. Then he pulled out his credit card, added a tip that was twice the usual amount, and wrote a note on the receipt in his careful private school handwriting. "Thank you for your patience and professionalism. We didn't deserve it. We're sorry, we'll do better." Jessica picked up the receipt later, after they had left, and read the note with trembling hands. She felt something in her chest unknot, some tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. She'd been shaking when she first approached their table after the confrontation, remembering their earlier behavior, prepared for rudeness or anger, or the kind of performance cruelty that some people engaged in when their egos had been bruised. Instead, they had been almost painfully polite. Had said please and thank you with the earnestness of people relearning basic courtesy, like children practicing good manners under a parent's watchful eye. She carried the receipt to the back and showed Marcus Chen, who smiled and tucked it into his pocket. "He'll want to see that," he said, nodding toward table 7 where Marcus Washington sat in conversation with the anniversary couple, listening intently to their story of 50 years together. And indeed, when Marcus Washington finished his meal and came back to check on the evening service, as he did every Friday night when he was in town, a ritual that kept him connected to the heartbeat of his restaurants, Marcus Chen handed him the receipt. The billionaire read it, his expression unreadable for a moment, his dark eyes scanning the words, processing the sentiment. Then he nodded, just once. A gesture of acknowledgement that contained volumes of understanding. "Growth," he said simply. "It's possible for everyone. If they're willing. If they're humble enough to learn. If they can look at themselves honestly and admit they were wrong." He folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, adding it to the collection of small moments that reminded him why he did what he did, why he had built this empire not just for profit but for purpose. He walked through the kitchen next, as he always did, because a restaurant was only as good as the people who worked behind the scenes. In the heat and pressure and controlled chaos, where food became art, he shook hands with the line cooks, their whites stained with the evidence of a busy night. Complimented Chef Pierre on the duck, watched the older man's face light up with pride at the recognition. Asked the pastry chef about the new dessert, a deconstructed tiramisu that was selling incredibly well, and listened to her explain the technique with the enthusiasm of an artist describing her process. He found the dishwasher, an older Hispanic man named Roberto who had worked in the kitchen for 12 years, and asked about his mother's surgery. Because he remembered. Always remembered. Carried every detail about his team's lives with the same care he carried his business plans, his expansion strategies, his quarterly projections. "She's doing well, Mr. Washington. Thank you for asking. And thank you for the flowers. She cried when they arrived. I'm glad she's recovering. You let me know if you need time off. Family comes first. Always." In the prep area, a young cook named David nervously approached him, wiping his hands on his apron, his face earnest and young. "Mr. Washington? Can I ask you something?" "Always. How do you stay calm like that? When people disrespect you. When they make assumptions. When they treat you like you don't matter." David's voice was quiet, but underneath ran a current of personal experience, of pain barely concealed. "I would have lost it. Would have said things I couldn't take back." Marcus Washington leaned against a stainless steel counter, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Around them, The kitchen continued its controlled ballet, dishes being plated, orders being called, the symphony of a professional kitchen at peak service. But he gave David his full attention, because questions like this mattered more than any plate of food ever could. "I used to lose it," he said finally. "When I was younger. When the wounds were fresh, and every slight felt like a confirmation of what some people wanted me to believe about myself. Got me nowhere except angry and tired. Made me bitter. Made me small." He paused, choosing his words carefully, wanting to get this right. "But here's what I figured out, what took me years to learn, what cost me relationships and opportunities and peace of mind before I finally understood. When someone disrespects you based on their assumptions, their ignorance, their prejudice, that's about them, not you. That's their poverty showing, not yours. Their limitations, not yours. Their fear and insecurity wrapped in arrogance and cruelty." David nodded slowly, absorbing this like a plant soaking up water. "Getting angry gives them power over your emotions. Lets them control how you feel, how you act, how you move through the world. Staying calm, staying dignified, proving them wrong through actions rather than arguments? That's power you keep for yourself. That's you refusing to let their ignorance define your character." "And if they don't learn?" David asked quietly. "If they walk away and nothing changes?" Marcus smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "Then they carry that weight their whole lives. They stay small while you grow. They stay trapped in their prejudices while you build empires. They stay stuck while you soar." He paused. "But at least you gave them the chance. At least you showed them another way. What they do with that opportunity is up to them." He clapped the young cook on the shoulder, felt the tension in the younger man's muscles, the coiled energy of someone still learning how to move through a world that didn't always see him clearly. "You keep working hard. Keep treating people right. Keep building your skills and your character in equal measure. The rest takes care of itself. Not always as fast as we'd like. Not always as fairly as we deserve. But eventually, inevitably, the truth comes out. Quality rises. Character shines through. And the people who tried to count you out have to watch you count your blessings." By 11 o'clock, the dining room was beginning to empty. The last few tables lingered over coffee and cognac, unwilling to let the evening end, holding on to the magic of good food and good wine and the story they would carry with them into tomorrow. Bradley and Amber had left an hour earlier, walking out with their heads down, their earlier swagger completely absent. They didn't notice the other diners watching them go, didn't hear the whispered conversations about second chances and learning moments, about the grace of a man who could have destroyed them but chose to teach them instead. Marcus Washington sat at table 7 with a cup of espresso, reviewing notes for a new restaurant, opening in Seattle, a waterfront location with views of the Sound, a menu that would showcase Pacific Northwest seafood, a design that would honor the building's industrial history while creating something entirely new. Around him, his staff began the careful choreography of closing tables wiped down with practiced efficiency, chairs straightened into perfect alignment, floors swept and mopped, the restaurant being reset for tomorrow's service. They moved with practiced efficiency, but also with something else. Pride. They worked for a man who had built an empire but never forgot where he came from. Who wore his success like a well-tailored suit, present, evident, but never the only thing defining him. Who treated them not as employees, but as partners in something larger than any single person, any single restaurant, any single meal. Marcus Chen approached with the evening's receipts, the ritual that marked the end of every Friday service. "Busy night." "Good night," Marcus Washington corrected gently. "The kind that matters. The kind people remember." "You think they learned something? That couple?" The billionaire set down his espresso, considering the question with the same care he gave everything that mattered. "I think they learned they're not as important as they thought. That money doesn't buy character. That power comes from integrity, not arrogance." He paused. "Whether they do anything with that knowledge? Whether it changes them or just embarrasses them? That's up to them. But everyone in this room tonight saw that dignity and respect aren't about your bank balance. They're about character. And that lesson? That spreads. Like ripples in water. Touching people we'll never meet." He stood, buttoning his suit jacket with the same precision that marked everything he did. "Same time next week? Your table will be ready." They shook hands, two men named Marcus who understood that titles and positions mattered less than the content of your actions. Who knew that respect was earned through consistency, not demanded through authority. Who had built something together that was larger than either of them alone. Then the billionaire walked toward the exit, pausing to thank the coat check attendant by name, to wave at the sous chef visible through the kitchen window, to hold the door for an elderly couple making their slow way out into the September night. Small gestures. Basic courtesy. The kind of behavior he expected from his staff because he modeled it himself, every single day. The night air was cool against his face as he stepped onto the sidewalk, crisp with the promise of autumn coming. His driver waited with the car, engine idling, door ready to open. But Marcus waved him off with a gesture that had become familiar over the years. "I'll walk tonight, James." "You sure, boss?" "It's getting late." "Positive." "Beautiful evening. Shouldn't waste it sitting in traffic when I can walk through the city I love." He walked 4 blocks through the city he'd helped build. Past storefronts whose owners he knew by name, past street vendors setting up for the late-night crowd, past a homeless man to whom he handed 2 $20 bills and a business card for one of his restaurants. "Show them this. Tell them Marcus sent you. They'll give you a meal. A real one." Past a group of teenagers laughing outside a pizza place, their joy uncomplicated and infectious. Just another person moving through the world at the end of a Friday night. Except he wasn't. He was proof that the world could be different. That success didn't require stepping on others. That power could lift instead of crush. That you could build an empire and still treat every person you met with dignity and respect. Behind him, La Couronne's lights glowed warm in the darkness, a beacon of something larger than food and wine and expensive linens. Inside, Jessica was counting her tips, already calculating how much she could put toward next semester's tuition, feeling grateful and valued, and seen in a way that made the long hours worth it. David was practicing a new technique the head chef had shown him, dreaming of his own restaurant someday, believing now that it was possible. Marcus Chen was double-checking tomorrow's reservations, making sure every detail was perfect because standards mattered, and consistency was everything. And in apartments across the city, in homes in the suburbs, people who had dined at La Couronne that evening were telling the story. Telling their partners, their children, their friends who called to ask how dinner was. The story of a young couple who learned that assumptions have consequences. The story of a man who could have humiliated them but chose to teach them instead. The story that proved you could be powerful without being cruel, wealthy without being callous, successful without forgetting your humanity. Table 7 would be empty until next Friday. Reserved. Waiting. But its lesson would echo much longer, spreading through the city like light through a prism, reaching people who would never eat at La Couronne but would hear the story and maybe, possibly, hopefully, treat the next server they encountered with a little more respect. Tip a little more generously. Look people in the eye. Remember that dignity was not negotiable based on job titles or bank accounts. Because real power doesn't shout. It doesn't demand or threaten, or prove itself to strangers in expensive restaurants. Real power sits quietly at its reserved table, treats every person with dignity, and lets its actions speak louder than any words ever could. And somewhere in the city, in a luxury apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline, Bradley and Amber sat on opposite ends of an expensive sofa, staring at their phones without really seeing them. Replaying the evening's events over and over like a film they couldn't stop watching. They had walked into La Couronne thinking they owned the world. They had walked out knowing they barely owned themselves. But they had also walked out with something they didn't have before. A choice. To remain who they were entitled, thoughtless, cruel in small ways that accumulated into something rotten. Or to become something different. Something better. Something worthy of the privileges they had been born into. The next morning, Bradley would wake up early, unable to sleep, and remember the way Marcus Washington had stood his ground without aggression, without cruelty, without needing to prove anything. The way his calm had been more powerful than any shouting could be. He would think about his father, about the empire of real estate built on the backs of tenants struggling to make rent, and wonder if empire was the right word, or just a comfortable lie they told themselves. He would pick up his phone and make a call to his father's office. Would ask questions he should have asked years ago about their eviction policies, their maintenance standards, the way they treated the people whose rent payments funded their lifestyle. He would suggest changes. Improvements. A foundation to help struggling families. His father would be surprised, resistant at first, but Bradley would persist. Because growth was possible. Change was possible, if you were willing. Amber would remember Jessica Torres and the way she'd served them with professionalism despite their earlier behavior, despite having every reason to be cold or dismissive or to let her hurt show. Would remember her dark skin catching the light, her patient smile, the way she'd treated them with dignity they hadn't earned. And Amber would feel the shame of her own assumptions burning in her chest like acid that wouldn't dissolve. She would think about her mother, who volunteered at charity galas but never actually talked to the people she claimed to help. Who wrote checks but never got her hands dirty. Who performed compassion like a role in a play. And Amber would decide that she wanted to be different. Would call the number on Marcus Washington's foundation website and ask about volunteering. Real volunteering. Not serving at a soup kitchen once a year for a photo opportunity, but actual, consistent, meaningful engagement with people whose lives were nothing like hers. Whether they would actually follow through remained to be seen. Change was hard. Old patterns were comfortable. Privilege was seductive in its ease. But the seed had been planted. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes a single moment could alter the trajectory of an entire life, if you let it, if you were brave enough to acknowledge your own flaws, and humble enough to grow. Marcus Washington reached his brownstone in the historic district, the building his grandfather had once cleaned as a janitor before Marcus bought it outright 40 years later and restored it to its original glory. He climbed the steps slowly, feeling the weight of 58 years, feeling the satisfaction of a good day's work, feeling the complex mixture of pride and humility that came from knowing he had built something meaningful. He unlocked the door with a key that was older than most of his employees, stepped inside, and set his keys in the ceramic dish his daughter Alicia had made in pottery class 23 years ago, when she was 10 and believed her father could do anything. She was a doctor now, working in pediatrics, carrying forward his values of service and dignity into her own career. He was proud of her in ways that transcended words. Tomorrow he had meetings with investors about the Seattle location. A menu tasting for a potential Dallas expansion. A call with his foundation about expanding the scholarship program to 3 more cities. They had already sent 212 students to college, had changed 212 lives, had proven that opportunity could break cycles of poverty if you gave people the tools and the chance. The work never ended. The responsibility never lifted. But tonight, he had reminded a room full of people that wealth was a tool, not an identity. That power was a responsibility, not a weapon. That respect was earned through actions, not purchased with dollars, or inherited with last names. He poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, not expensive scotch but simple bourbon, the kind his mother used to keep in the cabinet for special occasions they could rarely afford, and sat in his favorite chair by the window. From here, he could see the city lights stretching toward infinity, each one representing a story, a life, a person trying to make it through the world, with some measure of dignity intact. And he smiled. Not a smile of triumph or vindication, but something quieter. Something that came from knowing he had stayed true to himself, had wielded power with grace, had taught a lesson without crushing the students. Because he owned restaurants and real estate, stocks and bonds, more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. But what he really owned, what really mattered, was something far more valuable than any quarterly earnings report or property portfolio. His integrity, his dignity, his humanity, the respect of people who mattered, the knowledge that he had built something meaningful, had created jobs and opportunities, had proven that success didn't require stepping on others to reach the top. The things that no one could take from him. The things that no amount of money could buy. The things that made him rich in ways that balance sheets could never measure. In ways that mattered long after the restaurants closed, and the buildings crumbled, and all that remained was the impact he had made on the lives he touched. Table 7 would wait for him next Friday. But the lesson it taught tonight would last forever, spreading through the city like seeds on the wind, taking root in unexpected places, growing into something larger than any single moment, any single confrontation, any single restaurant, because that was the real power. Not the ability to humiliate or dominate or crush, but the ability to teach, to elevate, to show people a better way forward, to prove through actions that dignity and respect were not negotiable. That character mattered more than credit limits. That how you treated people when you had all the power was the truest measure of who you really were. And Marcus Washington, sitting in his favorite chair with 2 fingers of bourbon and a lifetime of lessons learned the hard way, knew exactly who he was. Knew exactly what he had built. Knew exactly why it mattered. The lights of the city stretched on forever. And somewhere in that vast tapestry of human existence, people were learning. Growing. Becoming better than they were yesterday. Because someone had shown them the way. Because someone had been strong enough to be gentle, powerful enough to be kind, successful enough to remember that none of it meant anything if you lost your humanity in the pursuit of wealth. The lesson of Table 7 would spread. And the world would be just a little bit better for it.